welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us here at the Mechanics Institute. I'm Laura Shepard, Director of Events, and we're very pleased to welcome you to our program with Claudia Marseille and Zack Rogow, who will be in conversation about their new memoirs, But You Look So Normal, and Hugging My Father's Ghost. In their writings, Marseille and Rogow navigate complex topics of familial trauma, loss, coming of age, and resilience with tenderness, honesty, and humor. And after our program, we'll have a Q&A with you, our audience. Now, for those of you who are new to the Mechanics Institute, we were founded in 1854, and we're one of San Francisco's most vital literary and cultural centers here in the heart of the city. We feature our general interest library on the second and third floors, our international chess club, and we have ongoing author and literary programs throughout the year, and also our Cinema Lit film series every Friday night. So please visit our website and join us for our upcoming programs. I'd like to mention that if you are new, please join us on Wednesday at noon for a free tour. Our librarians and our staff will take you around our gorgeous Beaux-Arts building and give you an introduction to the library, its collection, and all of our activities and the history of Mechanics Institute. And now about these books and our guest authors. In this inspiring and moving memoir, Claudia Marseille weaves the family history into a compelling account of growing up and living with an invisible disability, of emerging from silence and finding her voice as an artist. In Holding My Father's Ghost, Zack Rogow tries to resolve the mystery of the father he never knew. Lee Rogow was a widely published fiction writer, drama critic for The Hollywood Reporter, and a glamorous man about town in Manhattan in the 1950s. During World War II, he died tragically in a plane crash when Zack was only 3 years old. Both of these stories have potent messages and lessons, unresolved issues of childhood, and also great resonance and also resilience throughout adulthood. So our first presenter is Zack Rogow. I'm going to give a little bio. Zack is an author, editor, and translator of more than 20 books and works for the theater. His play, Colette Uncensored, had its first staged reading at the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C., ran in London, Indonesia, Catalonia, San Francisco, Portland, but we can't forget a fantastic performance here at the Mechanics Institute for our Fête de Colette. His honors include the PEN Book of the Month Club Translation Prize, the Lily Fabili Eric Hoffer Essay Prize from the University of California, Berkeley, and the Celestine Award for Poetry from Holy Names University. Rogow's blog, Advice for Writers, features more than 275 posts. His literary translations from French include works by Colette, Georges Sand, André Breton, and Marcel Pagnol. So please welcome first, Zack Rogow.
Thank you, Laura, for that introduction. I'm very excited to be here with Claudia Marseille, whose book is really wonderfully written, and I was very surprised to hear that this was Claudia's first book, because it's so artfully constructed and moving. So as, let me see how this works here. My book is Hugging My Father's Ghost, and it takes place in New York in the 1950s. And it's about my dad, Lee Rogow, York for the Hollywood Reporter. And the way that worked is that he and my mom would go to opening nights on Broadway, and right after the show, he would run to the Western Union office in Times Square. He'd write out his review in block letters right there, standing in the Western Union office, and the telegraph operator would then telegraph the review to LA, where it would appear the next morning in the Hollywood Reporter. My dad and mom were a glamorous couple. Let's see if we have some more photos here. Oh, there we go. There they are in Fire Island. My mom had the first bikini in Fire Island, New York, which she designed herself and had a seamstress sew. And let's see. So here's my dad. Here my mom. And my dad was also in World War II, as Laura mentioned. He was the captain of a ship. I'll talk more about that in a minute. And very tragically, he died in 1955 when I was 3 years old in a plane crash. So I didn't really know my dad. And I have one memory of him, which was sitting in the kitchen where he was making his signature mishmash soup, he called it. And that consisted of a mixture of Campbell's chicken noodle and Campbell's tomato soup. Very gourmet cooking in those days, the 1950s. And so writing about him was not easy because everyone in his generation who knew him had died off by the time I started working on this book. Most of the people my age were too young to remember him. There were some older siblings who I interviewed who remembered my dad. But fortunately, he was a writer. And he left an enormous body of work, most of which was published, but some of which was not published. And interestingly, his unpublished work was in many ways more revealing. And parts of that are included in the book, including his journal that he kept during World War II. How he kept a journal in the middle of the war while he was a captain of a ship in the Navy, I don't know, but he had a typewriter with him. And the actual typewritten pages were lovingly put into the memoir by the publisher's designer. So I'm going to talk a little bit about his writing. He served in the Navy in World War II, and you might remember that following the Pearl Harbor attack in December 1941, the officer corps of the Navy was decimated, and the Navy in general was decimated. And in order to gear up for the war, they had to recruit a huge number of officers almost overnight. And there were a group of people who were called the 90-day wonders, who went from never having stepped onto a boat, in my father's case, other than the Hoboken ferry from New Jersey and Manhattan, to being officers in the U.S. Navy in the course of 90 days. And one of the people my dad served with in this 90-day wonder school was the author to be Herman Wouk, who was a very important figure in my parents' generation. He was the first Jewish American to win the Pulitzer Prize in Literature for his novel, Came Mutiny. And one of the things I discovered in digging in through my father's papers and through this novel is that Herman Wouk based the main character of Came Mutiny on my dad. Wow. And the main character's girlfriend is based on my dad's girlfriend at the time, who was a nightclub singer named Sugar, who was also a USO entertainer who entertained the troops during World War II. I found this photo of her online from the National Archives. And I knew Sugar quite well growing up, but I didn't know that she had been my dad's girlfriend. And so part of what the novel is about is that my mom, it turns out, was married before she was married to my dad. And the person who she was married to then became Sugar's husband. So the couple switched partners. This I had no idea about growing up. I only knew Sugar and my mom's ex as my godparents growing up. So that's part of what comes out in this memoir. So I'm going to read you a little bit from my dad's journal that he kept during World War II, because it tells a lot about him as a person. And that journal is included, it's a fragment of a journal, but it's included in the book. And for example, it was very new to him to be on a boat. He describes the sensation of the sea, what it's like when you're on a boat all day. And he says, its noise is with you always, part splashing, part sighing and moaning, part gurgling, hissing, roaring. You don't hear it most of the time, and at night it becomes insistent in the quiet. Its motion is with you always. In bed, it rocks you, and I get the feeling that my bed is detached from the ship and floating with the motion of the sea. So he was only 23 years old when he kept his journal, but I think it's quite exceptional. There's something very fresh and honest about it. He even talks about the fact that he didn't want to serve in the U.S. Armed Forces. In fact, when Pearl Harbor happened, his first response was not to enlist, but to go out and buy a chocolate cake, because he knew it would be the last chocolate cake he'd eat for a long time. And then he also writes about his girlfriend Sugar in this journal, and he wrote, I thought of Sugar in Bermuda. I think she was then either performing at a nightclub or entertaining the troops, I'm not sure. And I thought I would write her a letter saying, when I go to bed, my last waking thought is of you. And when I lean on the rail and look at the yellow moon, and on its light upon the waters, my thought is of you. I remember you in your black dress, when we sat on the raincoat on the lawn at Grosvenors until 5 o'clock, and how I put the coat around my shoulders and went leaping around the lawn. I remember you in that white terry cloth bathrobe, and how your face looked up at me when I kissed you last. And I remember how I nearly swooned against the wall of the bachelor's office quarters lounge when I said, I'm crazy for you. And you said, and I'm crazy for you. Perhaps I will write all of that one day to you, or tell it to you, but I will save it for now. So one of the things that I learned about my dad from reading this journal, which was kept in my sister's basement for many decades, is that he was a man who was capable of expressing his whole heart and his deep love. And there were so many male writers in that generation who were trying to out Hemingway, who always had to have a gun or a fishing rod in hand in their stories, and who basically were part of that sort of macho cult of the writer in the 1950s. And my dad was not like that. He wrote quite differently about families that he knew, about his own feelings. So that was quite enlightening to find this out about my dad. So one of the things that happened after the war is that Herman Woe published that book, The Cave Mutiny, which was such a huge success and won the Pulitzer Prize. And my dad, who was a book reviewer as well as a drama critic, was assigned to review his friend Herman Woe's novel. And surprisingly, my dad gave the book a very mixed review. In fact, he said some very, very critical things in the book, because he felt that Herman Woe had, in a sense, been justifying this dictatorial character, Captain Queeg, played in the movie by Humphrey Bogart, who he felt was a very negative force. And so my dad wrote in his review, it is true, of course, that the professional sailors and soldiers were necessary to America's triumph by arms, but I don't see that this could ever be made a justification for cruelty, stupidity, and downright insanity in the officer class. So one of the things that happened to me when I was writing this book, not having a lot to go on about what my dad was really like, was that I started to hear his voice in my head. And when you start hearing voices in your head, it's usually a bad thing. But if you're a writer, that's the best thing. Because when you're hearing voices, you know that you've got something that has somehow latched onto you. And so not only did I hear his voice, but I heard voices of his peers and my own voice responding to him. So quite a bit of the book is these imaginary conversations. So I'm going to read you one of these. And what I imagined here is a conversation between my dad and Herman Woog the first time they encountered each other after he published this negative review of Herman Woog's book. And I'm imagining it takes place at Fire Island, which is where we spent the summers on Long Island, where Herman Woog's family had a house very near to our own. And so imagine that you're at a cocktail party on Fire Island in the 1950s. And my mom is at first talking to my dad, and she says, "Nice party, huh?" And my dad responds, "Well, if you like having great martinis on the patio overlooking the ocean around sunset and stimulating conversation with brilliant and funny people. Myself, I'd rather be starting a shift in it all night." And that was kind of the sense of humor my dad had. It was this sort of New York opposite humor. You know, you walk into a subway car in New York in the middle of the summer, it's 100 degrees and everybody's sweating, and somebody says, "Great day, huh?" You know, it's that kind of humor. And my mom says, "Don't look now, Lee, but isn't that Herman Woog bearing down on you? I think I'm going to go get some of those delicious hors d'oeuvres at the table way at the other end of the patio. Can I get you anything?" And my dad says, "Just a shield and a helmet." So my mom says, "Blame the review on me." Exit my mom, enter Herman Woog. So Herman says, "Well, if it isn't Lee Rogow. I don't know if you remember me, I'm your neighbor here on Fire Island. We were buddies in the 90-Day Wonder School. I'm a fellow writer, and our kids play together." And my dad says, "You look vaguely familiar." And Herman says, "So, been writing any pieces lately for the Saturday Review?" And my father says, "Look, Herman, I was all set to give your novel a great review. I'd written a draft, and then Mickey read the book, and she insisted that it needed a more nuanced treatment." And Herman says, "Nuance? You mean like stabbing someone in the back is nuance?" And my dad says, "Like the umpire says, Herman, I call them as I see them." And Herman Woog says, "Well, fortunately, the fans never agree with the umps." And my dad says, "What do the fans say about writers who use the private information that their buddies tell them about their girlfriends in 90-Day Wonder School?" And Herman says, "Oh, come on, Lee, you're a writer. You know we're magpies. We grab any shiny object and we take it to the nest." And my dad says, "It seems to me you've been taking many shiny objects to the bank lately. How many weeks has it came you've been at the top of the New York Times bestseller list?" And Herman says, "Sorry, lost count. 30." And my father says, "So what are you doing for an encore? Don't tell me you're adapting the novel for Hollywood." And Herman says, "Actually, I am. I hope you're not planning to review the movie." So interestingly, after this review was published, my dad and Herman Woog stayed friends. And I wonder whether, on some level, the novelist Herman Woog appreciated the fact that my dad gave him a nuanced and mixed review, rather than just, a friendly pat on the back. And not only did they stay friends, but Herman Woog delivered the eulogy at my dad's funeral, and he wrote a very glowing tribute to my dad that was published in the Saturday Review, the same magazine where my dad had published the review of Herman's book. So we're going to talk more with Claudia, but I'll pass it over to Claudia.
First, I'd like to introduce Claudia. After earning her master's degree in archaeology and in public policy. And finally, an MFA. Claudia Marseille developed a career in photography and painting, a profession compatible with hearing loss. She ran a fine art portrait photography studio for 15 years, becoming a full-time painter. Her paintings are now presented by the Sigurd Ray Gallery in Mill Valley, California. In her free time, Claudia loves to read, watch movies, travel, spend time with friends, attend concerts and art exhibits, and play classical piano. She and her family live in Oakland. And also, I'd like to say I've known of Claudia's incredible work, her beautiful artwork, from the day that I moved to Berkeley, 1995, and went to the first open studios at her house. And so I'm very pleased to welcome her to Mechanics Institute.
Thank you so much, Laura, Andy, and others at the Mechanics Institute for making it possible to have this presentation in this lovely space. And also thank you to all of you to being here in the audience as we launch our memoirs out into the world. And I'm honored to be with you, Zack. You're a very wonderful and experienced writer, and for us to be in dialogue together will be a lot of fun. So my memoir is about my life lived with a very severe hearing loss from birth, at a time when hearing technology was still very primitive. I also weave in the complex relationship with my German refugee parents, a disturbed psychoanalyst father, and a Jewish mother, survivor of the Holocaust. All of these influences greatly shaped who I am today. In this presentation, I want to share some of what it was like growing up with a severe hearing loss and how I dealt with what, for me, was the most challenging obstacle of my hearing loss. By age 4, I had still not spoken a word. Finally, my severe to profound hearing loss was diagnosed, and then began the long journey of learning to hear, speak, and lip read, with the help of a large primitive hearing aid and almost 10 years of speech therapy and lip reading training. My first hearing aid was an analog hearing aid, nothing like the sophisticated digital hearing aids that we have today. And I was also on half power because that analog hearing aid, which was clipped to my undershirt, could only accommodate hearing in one ear at a time. So I was really just hearing half power. My parents chose to mainstream me, and I went through the Berkeley public school system. And as I said, they were refugees from Germany and were under their own stresses adjusting to life in America, and they simply did not advocate for me as they could have and should have. By 3rd grade, I realized I was different. There was so much I simply could not understand. I couldn't socialize with the other kids in the very noisy school cafeterias, which is where much of childhood socializing happened. I couldn't understand what was said on the TV. I certainly couldn't lip read the animals of the cartoons that everybody was watching. I couldn't understand the neighborhood games and the rules of the games unless my brother came up to me or a friend and explained what was going on. I couldn't understand the conversations that were going on in the car. I couldn't understand the conversations around the dining room table, especially when I was younger. And I certainly couldn't understand classroom discussions where there was a lot of back and forth, where I couldn't follow what was being said. So now I'm going to read the prologue from my memoir, which takes about 5 minutes. And it's when I'm in 6th grade, I'm 11 years old, and I'm about to run races in the all-city Berkeley track meet. It was the day of the citywide elementary and middle school track meet, and I was elated I had made the cut, one of only 2 students at our school. At age 11, I was a good athlete and very fast, and I was thrilled to have the chance to compete against other 6th and 7th graders from across Berkeley. I had trained hard for this day. For weeks after school, my teacher, a soccer coach, drilled my friend Mark and me hard on our school playground. yelling at us to sprint faster, faster. Day after day, I pushed harder and harder as I raced Mark, the only kid in our school who could run faster than I, and I could feel myself getting better. I also depended on Mark to help me navigate the hearing world. Like my brother Elliot, Mark was very attuned to me. On the playground, he faced me directly and clearly repeated what had been said, carefully explaining where we were to line up, how far we would be running, and who had taken first, second, and third place. Now, standing in the center of the field, I surveyed the bustling scene, and to my surprise, I didn't see anyone I knew. Athletes wearing their school colors stretched out on the grass or jogged in place, excited families settled into their seats in the bleachers, coaches with clipboards dashed here and there. My heart thumped in anticipation of the moment when I would launch from the starting line with a pack of runners, sprint neck and neck alongside other contestants, fiercely determined to beat me, and then finally stretched into the finish to break the tape. That morning, I fastened my bulky hearing aid with an extra strap to ensure it wouldn't fall off from where it was clipped to my undershirt. I was ready. I was eager for my mother and father to see how fast I could run, and I looked all around, anxious to spot them in the crowd. Searching the glaring hot metal bleachers, I finally spotted them sitting across the field from each other. Their fraught divorce had left them with no desire to sit together, even to show united support for me. My father looked grim and formal in his dark wool suit, and he wore a handkerchief on his head, each corner tied with a little knot, which created a kooky little hat to protect him from the sun. I watched him wipe sweat from his forehead and wondered why on earth would he wear a heavy suit on such a hot day. Far across the field from him sat my mother, looking cool and elegant despite the sweltering heat, fumbling for something in her purse. In the distance, I saw a coach yelling instruction into an orange megaphone as sprinters began to line up for races, but I couldn't understand a word he said. I had trained at my familiar elementary school playground, and I was totally unprepared for how the track meet would unfold in this unfamiliar place. I still couldn't see anyone I recognized, and I began to panic. Was one of my events just now about to start? Where should I go? Frantically, I whipped my head around looking for Mark. Mark, I thought. Mark will tell me what to do, where to go. Frantically, I whipped my head around looking for him, but he was nowhere to be found. Then, as kids started running, I stood frozen, a little statue in the middle of the field as races whirled around me. Coaches started about, herding kids and lining up races. Athletes whizzed past me as they took their places, ran their races, and whooped with joy when they won. But almost nobody asked if I needed help. No one seemed to notice that for almost an hour I hadn't moved from where I stood rigid on the track. Finally, it was all over. As everyone streamed off the field, I saw my father in the distance, slinking away through the far exit. My mother was waiting for me by the bleachers, and we walked slowly towards the car. She looked concerned. "Why didn't you run in any of the races?" she asked. I burst into tears. I had no idea where to line up. I couldn't understand the man with the megaphone or what any of the kids were saying. My mother nodded and murmured sympathetically, but that was the end of the conversation. From the bleachers, both of my parents sat and watched me as I just stood there. Why hadn't they run across the field, grabbed me, and guided me to an adult in charge? Why didn't at least one of them recognize that I was in trouble and needed help? And now that the humiliating event was over, there was no exploration of what had happened, why I was so lost, and what might be done to spare me such shame in the future. As my mother drove us home, I cried quietly in the seat next to her and gazed out the window at the constant activity and clamor that made it so difficult for me to hear or understand people around me. A motorcycle roared in front of us. A bus screeched to a halt to our left. A truck beeped insistently as it backed up on our right. Whenever I was amidst these kind of city sounds, all I could hear was the tremendous clamor, and most of the time, interior spaces weren't any better. As I sat next to my mother, the rumble of our car made it virtually impossible to understand her unless she turned to face me, which she couldn't do while driving. Tears ran down my cheeks as I realized once again how terribly alone I was. Every day I struggled to understand. There was so much I was missing, and meanwhile, almost nobody was listening. So shortly after this was middle school, and that came two big changes. I got the first behind-the-ear hearing aids that were powerful enough for me. They were not yet digital hearing aids, but they were smaller. And then the other big change is I had my long braids that I had all through elementary school cut, and my hair was cut short like it is now, and my hearing aids were hidden under my ears. So for the first time, I did the very unhelpful strategy, which was to hide my hearing loss. Again, the cafeteria was very challenging. I couldn't understand what everybody was talking about at lunch about the different TV programs they were watching, and they were also listening to transistor radio. I couldn't follow the lyrics or the songs or what people were talking about, so I was really out of the loop in that way. Slumber parties were really painful because the lights would be turned out, the girls would be whispering and giggling in the dark. I had no idea what was being said. I couldn't lip read. So I would just I would just hide my hearing aid under a book and pretend to fall asleep. In the classrooms, I was at the mercy of what seat I was placed in. In some classes, I was placed in the front and I would do well in the class, and in some I was in the back and wouldn't do as well. I literally did not meet other people with hearing loss or that were deaf until my mid-30s. So I was very alone in this process. I went to a very large Berkeley high school with 4,000 students. They may well have been somebody else with a hearing loss. It would have been nice again to share that, but I didn't know of any of those students. So I did go through periodic episodes of isolation and loneliness. And it was this loneliness that was the hardest part of my hearing loss. My mother wanted me to be as normal as possible, and I protected her from my struggle, especially as she was under great stress herself, and after all, she was a Holocaust survivor. In high school, the same issues continued, but it was somewhat easier as I did make some new friends, and I relied on two loves, reading and playing the piano. I played the piano since I was 6 years old, and by high school I was getting to be quite good and enjoyed practicing several hours a day when I got home. After high school, I went for a year abroad for studying and travel, and I had my first love relationship then, and that gave me a lot of confidence. I came back to Berkeley to go to college at Berkeley, and ironically, going to a big college like UC Berkeley worked well because the classes were all lecture classes, so I could sit up front and follow the professor. If it had been a small liberal arts college with small classrooms with a lot of back and forth classroom discussion, I would have been very lost. I made good friends at college, but dorm life was hard with 3 meals a day and noisy dining rooms. There was also the parties that were difficult because of the very loud music that was going on. But I did tell more people about my hearing loss, and I would often get this response, "Oh, that's what it was. I thought you were really stoned." After college, I married a son of a British lord and moved to London for 3 years to England. And I won't go into it here, you can read about it in the memoir, but that marriage quickly imploded and I came back to Berkeley. And at that point, I realized I needed to support myself. So I got a master's from the Graduate School of Public Policy at Berkeley. It was an excellent program, but very challenging. This was long before the internet age, long before emailing. And so in order to get information, we had to use the phone. And I don't know if I mentioned that earlier, but using the phone was really, really difficult for me. And I had a kind of phone phobia until actually very recently, which I'll get to. So the graduate school program was challenging because of the phone, and then the few jobs I had afterwards also were challenging because of the need to use the phone on the job. And I didn't tell my lovely bosses and my lovely colleague that I had hearing loss because at that time I was afraid of jeopardizing my job. This was well before the Americans with Disabilities Act, And so that fear was not unfounded. Then I met my current husband, and my life became much easier. He encouraged me to go into the visual arts, something I had always wanted to study, but couldn't because of the high cost of art school. But long story short, I worked as a photographer for 15 years, and then I got an MFA in painting in 2001 and was picked up by the Cedar Gray Gallery in Mill Valley that has represented me for the last 23 years. So I finally found a profession that was compatible with hearing loss. So as I mentioned in the beginning, I also bring in the story of my relationship with my parents. My father was disturbed. I don't know if he himself was depressed, but he certainly made the people around him depressed. He cast a kind of oppressive pall of the household that my brother and I offset with a lot of fun and creative and dynamic play. But still, there was kind of a lack of support and holding in the environment. But he was also a brilliant man and very colorful, and I do have sprinkled the memoir with vignettes of conversation between the two of us over the years. And I also covered my Jewish mother, my beloved Jewish grandmother's history of hiding from the Nazis in Munich during World War II. And I bring this up because they also partly shaped who I am today. They gave me a deep appreciation for the life of the mind and culture, for music, for literature, art, and beauty. And for that, I am deeply grateful. So, how did I overcome the obstacle of a severe hearing loss? As I said earlier, loneliness was the most difficult part of my hearing loss, and I dealt with this primarily by being very proactive all my life in cultivating close one-on-one friendship. I put a lot of effort into this. I also told more people about my hearing loss. I joined small groups centered around things I was interested in: books, piano playing, art, meditation, and a women's support group. I found a profession, the visual arts, that worked with my hearing loss, and I'm also very lucky I'm a good leader. But another very important thing that has made it possible for me to connect more easily with people are the profound changes in technology over the last 25 years. I can't stress enough the importance of these changes. The ones that had the most impact on my life are digital hearing aids. And I know many of you may be wearing digital hearing aids, you certainly know people who are, but that is really of the last 25 years. The first 45 years of my life, I did not have that. They can be programmed to a person's individual hearing loss, and they have different programs you can cycle through for different listening situations, noisy restaurants, for music, etc. The other huge thing was Bluetooth connectivity to my iPhone. And again, I can't stress the importance of this. This has finally ended my lifelong phone phobia. Closed captioning, I know a lot of you enjoy that, but it's great to finally be able to enjoy TV and movies. Zoom is great because I can both lip read and hear through the Bluetooth connectivity to my hearing aids. Also, around 1990 came the Americans with Disabilities Act and other legislation which helped promote more awareness and acceptance of disability. I still have ongoing issues despite these advances. Noisy restaurants is challenging. I'm left out of noisy group situations and classes where I can't follow the banter. COVID mask is a nightmare for those of us who rely on the breathing. I can't go to the theater unless I can read the script ahead of time. Comedy and improv shows are totally out because you can't read the script ahead of time. But I do have a deep gratitude for all the advances that have been made. Because of these advances, the close connections I've made over the years in my artwork, I have largely made peace with my hearing loss. So finally, what are some of the takeaways for you? Loneliness caused by hearing loss is a real thing. A new study published this year by the medical journal Lancet shows that U.S. adults with hearing loss who regularly wear hearing aids have significantly less social isolation, depression, and even dementia, which makes total sense to me. So if you are struggling with a hearing loss or your loved one is, get hearing aids and wear them all the time. Many people still refuse to wear them. I can't tell you how many friends tell me they need hearing aids, they just got them, they're in their pockets, they left them at home, they've lost them, they've flushed them down the toilets. I mean, I've heard it all. But you will not lose your hearing aids if they're in your ears 16 hours a day, and you will eventually get used to it, and it will make a huge difference in helping you connect with the people that are important to you. So finally, in my memoir, I hope to get an interesting inside glimpse into a life lived with severe hearing loss, the different impacts it's had on my life, and how I overcame significant hearing challenges. Hopefully my memoir will help create empathy, compassion, and understanding for those among us who face differences in abilities.
Now we're going to invite both of our authors to come up and have a conversation. Testing 1, 2.
Well, Claudia and I talked about the fact that even though there are many differences in our lives and in our memoirs, there are also some very surprising commonalities. And one thing that really stuck with me about your memoir, Claudia, is the portrait of your dad, and what a complex and interesting person he was. Can you talk a little bit more about him, and maybe we can talk about how similar and different our childhoods were in that sense?
Well, I think one of the main differences we have is you really did not know your father at all, except through his writing. And so he's a total mysterious person in your life. I did know my father on and off until I was 11. And then after my parents got divorced, he moved abruptly back to Germany, and I saw him only a few more times. I never really knew him as an adult. And I have no relatives on his side at all. So he's kind of a little bit of a black hole for me as well. And I deeply regret I've not been able to know him more as an adult and ask him more about his very interesting, he trained as a psychoanalyst in Vienna in the post-Freud era. He studied under Heidegger. He fought in an underground against the Nazis in Germany. He married my mother when he came here. But he was also probably bipolar, which I know you haven't mentioned, but your mother was as well. So that's kind of an interesting commonality. He was crazy. He put me in a patch of poison oak when I was 6 months old and a baby to test whether I might develop an immunity to poison oak. And I got seriously ill with poison oak since then. When I was 10, he wanted to give me and my brother LSD because he thought that would be interesting to see how we reacted to LSD. He was involved in all kinds of different money-making schemes that all failed. He, at age 62, decided to be an opera singer and sing in a big community hall in Berkeley. That totally bombed. There were only, 20 people in the audience. So I have this strange mixture of love for him and aversion.
One of the things I enjoyed a lot about reading your book is that the characters are so well drawn and so complex, and the dad definitely fit that description because he is an incredibly brilliant man, and I think he wanted to express his love for his children, but it was almost too much for him to do that.
Yeah, I think, he had a custody battle with my mother, who wanted to get custody of us. He did not want to raise us, he just wanted to make life miserable. So then he did abruptly move to Germany and didn't pay child support, never invited us to visit him in Germany, never came and visited us. So he did love us, but didn't do what good parents would do. Whereas I get the sense that your father really would have been there for you. He seemed like a very loving and warm person from what I hear.
I do get that sense, and there's documentary evidence of that too, and yet my mom, who wound up being my main parent, was the less stable of the two parents, and in some ways reminiscent for me of how you described your dad, in the sense that she was very unpredictable, she was very smart, but she was also not an ideal parent in some ways, although she was very loving. She was so depressed a lot of the time that it was hard for her to function on a day-to-day basis, and that's one of the things that comes out in my dad's writings that were not published, that are in the book. Some of his short stories reveal that.
Did her depression affect your life and your sister's life? Was that something you picked up on?
I think very much. I mean, I think when you grow up as a child, and I think this is in your memoir too, and you feel like you have to protect your parent, it has a lifelong effect on you because it primes you for a certain type of relationship, and unless you become aware of that, it can be a very destructive pattern of relationships.
One of the things that I love is the title of your memoir, Hugging My Father's Ghost. It really gives me goosebumps, and I think it's a very apt title. How did you come up with that?
I don't remember the actual circumstances, but I do feel that it conveys some of my feeling that my father actually did, in a weird way, come to life for me in the book, in writing the book. That he seemed, as I said, his voice was in my head. It was a very strange experience. And he actually did write a piece that he never published that's in the book called Shake Hands with a Ghost, which is it was very eerie to discover this. I only discovered it at the very end of the writing process. My sister dug it out of her basement. And in that, he talks about being a ghost writer because he also made his living for the family, helped support the family as the ghost writer for the Broadway producer and Hollywood producer Billy Rose. And he discusses being the ghost in this piece, and it's, I don't know, it's just eerie, but he had an almost palpable presence for me during the time I was writing the book.
And was this memoir of yours long time coming? I know you've done all kinds of other writing, but is this something that you've read that you've had going on for a while, or how did that all happen?
I don't think I had a conscious plan to write this book until the COVID lockdown, and then I had a lot of time on my hands to really look over his work and think about him. I think for many years, the subject of my father was too sensitive to even come near it. And I didn't want to even read his writings. I didn't want to think about his absence. And somehow during COVID, because I was this cocoon, it was easier in a way to do that. One thing that did give rise to the book is that this group of 4 adults who were originally 2 different partners and then switched, none of them lived to a ripe old age, except Sugar, the nightclub singer who was the USO entertainer. And I was able to interview Sugar right before she died. So I got a lot of the real story from her, and that was perhaps the launch of the book. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that scene that you read where you're on the track and you're not able to compete, and how you place the reader so vividly in that situation. Do you have actual sensory memories of that, or did you invent some of it?
Oh, I definitely did not invent that. I mean, I maybe because of my hearing loss, I have a very good visual sense, and I have a very good memory. I can remember back till, I write about it in my memoir, back to before I could hear. I I just remember sensory impressions of what I saw. And so, no, that scene was very deeply embedded in my psyche. Yeah. So it just kind of came out.
So you also talk about how music was such an important part of your life, especially as a young person. But this is your first book, and I almost felt that your experience as a musician might have helped you to write this book in the sense that there's an emotional flow to a piece of music. And this book has a very clear emotional flow to it, and I'm wondering if you feel there's some connection.
That's a really interesting question. I've often thought of my writing as being a little bit like my painting, because abstract painting, you're kind of mining your inner psyche to bring out something that's manifested in the world. And with writing also, you go inside into your body, into your early memories, and then you bring out something into the world. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people ask, how can somebody with a hearing loss play the piano? And, you know, hearing loss for most people is not about volume, it's about discrimination. But the volume of the piano is fine. It's a big instrument, and you sit there and you can hear it. So I was able to hear fine, but then it was difficult when I would play with a cellist or violinist or in an orchestra, which I tried to do when I was a teenager, and hearing myself above those instruments did not work. So I had to, at one point, realize in my teens that I could not be a professional musician. But, I mean, that's what you mentioned about the flow, that I hadn't put that together, I have to say.
You know, one of the scenes that really stays with me is that Claudia went to a summer camp in Germany, and she describes very vividly how challenging that was because she didn't really speak German. But her mom had gone to that same camp, maybe? Is that why she's saying that?
My mother's best friends in Germany were anthroposophists. They were followers of Rudolf Steiner, and this was a Waldorf Rudolf Steiner school. And so I went to Germany when I was 14 for the first time to visit my father. So it had been 3.5 years. But part of that summer I was sent to that camp in Germany. And so it was my mother's good idea and these friends' good ideas that, oh, Claudia will love this camp. But not knowing any German and being, you know, seriously with a hearing handicap, I could not participate in any of the activities that was going on. You know, it was hard enough in English in middle school, but in Germany, in this German camp where everybody speaking German, I was totally lost. So that was a very difficult, painful experience for me.
But one of the things that works so well about that sequence for me in the book is that right before that, you talk about how you're visiting this family that's so warm and loving and communicative. And then she goes to the camp and it's very challenging and difficult and isolating. And usually it would be a professional writer who'd written many books who would think about, well, how am I going to contrast the scene of the camp with the scene of the family closeness? But you do that so intuitively in this book. It's just a wonderful read. I really enjoyed reading the book.
Well, thank you. One of the things, you know, I know for myself, I was at one point clearly motivated to write this memoir. And I don't know if you had a strong motivation to write this, or was this, you know, just something that you wanted to do from the heart at this point in your life? Leave a legacy for your children, or?
You know, I'm not exactly sure why I wrote this book. I think my first impulse was that there are these kernels of writing that my father did that I think are really good, that I wanted to share with other people. And then I felt I had to put them in some kind of context because we live in such a different time, and he didn't live to see all the changes that happened in the last 70 years. And so I felt like there had to be some bridge between his work and the present, so that people in the present could both understand his time and so that he could understand what had happened since then, and he had
Yeah, I mean, your book really portrays that life, that time in history very well. You know, the 50s and all of that.
I have a great affection for that time, even though in many ways it was a very conformist and repressive time. But there are things about that time that I find still very nostalgic and compelling. And yet it was also, also the changes that came later were so important and necessary. Maybe that tension was interesting to explore in the book.
I get asked the question often of what motivated me to write this memoir. And part of it, because came to writing later in life, part of it was just reflecting back on the different influences of my life and what have made me who I am today. But then more specifically, I would have friends come up to me who were getting age-related, hearing aid for age-related hearing loss. And they say to me, oh, now I know what it was like for you growing up with a hearing loss. And I say, as sympathetic as I am to people with hearing loss and dealing with it, getting used to it, I say, no, you really have no idea what it was like from birth. And again, I have to stress the importance of the fact that the hearing technology was really quite primitive at that time. And so that it was really wanting to get that out there so people would have some understanding of that.
Should we maybe open it up for questions?
Yes, I think it's a great idea. So I'll come around with the mic, so if you have a question, I'm coming your way.
Hello. Thank you for both of you. I want to ask a question, Claudia, but I want to proceed it with a comment. I was so struck by the scene at the track, I found myself hating your parents. I thought their behavior was unforgivable. But I want to ask you a question, and that has to do with revealing a disability or an illness. And I have friends who recently went through, the husband developed Parkinson's disease, and they did not tell anybody for about 3 years, even though the symptoms were getting bad. And when they finally did, their friends were so supportive and so warm. And of course, somebody said, well, why didn't you tell us sooner? And I wondered how you feel about this whole issue of revealing that part of yourself.
Yes, I mean, this whole thing about coming out, and a lot of us have coming outs in very many different ways of what that might mean to come out. But when I was in middle school, as I said, when I got my hair cut short, it felt like something to be ashamed of. There was a stigma of hearing loss. There is not, that's much, much less today. And there is certainly not a stigma in most cases for people wearing glasses. But for some reason, with hearing aid, people think you're a little slow, they think you're out of it, whatever. So, times have really changed now. Parents are really taught to advocate for their children. It's all out. The school counselors know, the teachers know, the classmates know. So it's a very different time than it was back then. And as I said, I was the only person at that time too, so I felt really very different. And my mother really missed the boat in that she should have gone to the school counselor and told the school counselor, who would tell all the teachers, and that it would be out front. And she always said, you need to deal with this yourself. But I was 10, I was 11, and I didn't have any modeling for how to advocate for myself, which is, as I said, it is different now. And yes, I mean, I have to say my husband has Parkinson's, and he's been very good about coming out and telling people, and people understand and are sympathetic, and then they also understand better, how one might be slightly off, and they understand where that's coming from. And people are kind and understanding when you tell them, on the whole.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for describing your experience before your hearing loss and how when you went through it. My other comment is that anybody that has dealt with any type of disability, and particularly if it involves speech or hearing, it's really quite hard for people to understand what that's about. And no, you do not want to go up to your friends and say, hey, by the way, I have a difficult time speaking because of whatever. And your comment about why people don't go there sooner, it takes a lot of guts. It takes a lot of guts to live through it. And it takes a lot of guts, and thank God I had not a father, but I had a mother that dealt with my disability and problems with my jaw circuit, etc. But people are not in our society, particularly in our world. I think it's getting better. But if you think about how people have dealt with disabilities in the past, and they're now dealing with disabilities now, it's quite different. And I hope people will start opening their ears, eyes, and appreciation for what's going on now.
Yeah, I've got a question for Zack. Well, actually, it'd be a question for either one of you. But it's just a kind of general question. Is there something particularly about your father that, when you look back on the process of writing the book, something that really surprised you about him and maybe changed the way you saw something in your life? I mean, what really stands out to you? Like, whoa, I never realized that before. I never realized that about him. I never realized that about myself.
Well, there's one story in the book called The Happy Affair that he never published or tried to publish. And my sister insists that this is pure fiction, but there's something about this story of a married man having an affair and his description of his wife that, to me, feels like it's not total fiction. And I ended up having a conversation, in quotes, with my dad about this, about whether it is fictional or not, and whether the description of the wife is the description of my mom. And the way that the conversation came to me is that my father completely denies that this is autobiographical. And I keep pressing him on this, and he keeps wiggling out of it. And I kind of imagine that is how he might have reacted in real life had he lived, in the sense that he never wanted to publish the story and never showed it to anybody that I know. And yet I think it's one of his best stories. Maybe his best story.
I think it's a wonderful story. I really like that one. That stood out for me. And the conversation that you had with your father after that was great too.
I mean, the odd thing about the story is that in some ways the young woman who's the other woman, the woman in the affair, is the most sympathetic character. It's told from her point of view. And interesting that he would tell the story that way too, and he would tell it so convincingly from her perspective. And even though she's much younger, she's the one who ultimately sort of understands that this affair has to end and is more adult about it. It's a complex and really interesting and funny story too. I mean, one of the things about my dad's sensibility that I learned is that he was able to mix humor and pathos in a way that I really admire and try to emulate in my own writing.
Question?
Yeah, and I apologize for the mask, but I need to wear it. I'm struck by the vulnerability of what you've each done, and I'm curious about psychologically what the process was like for each of you in terms of, did it bring you catharsis? Did it bring you resolution? Did it make you confront demons that you maybe wish you didn't confront? I'm just so curious, I think it's so brave what each of you has done, and I'm just curious about what that was like internally as you were going through it.
Well, that's a wonderful question. For me, it felt very vulnerable. It's a very personal and vulnerable story. I thought it would reveal a lot of different things. And the writing of it was very cathartic, and I enjoyed the actual process of writing. But now that it's out in the world, it's like, next, how is this thing going to be received? And you just don't know until it's out there. But yes, I would say, I started with little poetry vignettes, and then it got expanded, and then people in my writing group said, I think you have a full-blown memoir, which was not originally what I planned to do, and then it kind of grew from there. Yes, but it was, a lot of what I had described in the memoir has kind of laid to rest. It happened a long time ago, but the writing of it kind of brought it up fresh again, and so I had to kind of take another look at all of that and how it's shaped who I am today. And so I think there's hopefully another level of resolution that's coming out of all of it. But yeah, it was a vulnerable process.
Thank you.
It was emotionally very grueling at times to write this book. There were times that it was very cathartic and heartwarming to feel that closeness with my dad. There were other times that I just burst into tears in the middle of writing, which I didn't expect that. I didn't think it was still so raw 70 years later, but it was.
I have a question for you, Zach. You talked about conversations with your father. I know I've had conversations with my father after he passed, and obviously they were very different from the conversations I would have had with him, that you'd have with him when he was alive. And I'm curious how the conversations with your father transpired.
Well, a kind of odd dynamic came up in these conversations where he's sort of kidding me or teasing me in a kind of rough way. Like there's a point where, there's one story in the book where I felt like I had to rewrite one of the stories because it was a little dated. It was really a good story. It's about a couple who get together later in life. It's called Better Late. And I felt like it was so close to being complete and relevant today, and yet with a little bit of rewriting, it would be even better. So I rewrote the story, and my dad really objects to this. He says, last time I saw you, you were just getting over the terrible twos. At least I think you got over. There's a lot of rough banter back and forth between us. Well, I wrote the book, so I got to change the story. You have to judge for yourself.
If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank Claudia Marseille and Zack Rogow for an inspiring conversation. And thank them for revealing so much of their lives, and it was a wonderful talk. I hope those of you who are writers and are moved to write a memoir, I hope that you glean something from tonight's event and program. I thank you again. Join us at our next program coming up next week. Please see our website and be part of our Mechanics Institute family. Thank you. Good night. Oh, yes, the books are on sale, and you can buy them and have them signed.